Why don't we start? But anyway, I just wanted to say, first of all, I really couldn't be more delighted to introduce Georgia de Chamberet, who's going to talk about Lesley Blanch. And I just wanted to say that I've been fascinated in Lesley ever since I can remember. And since I live in Richmond, and Lesley married a man simply for his house in Richmond, how could I not be? I mean, it is hard to pin down the precise moment when I was aware of her work and her seductive talent. But anyway, thanks to Georgia, who is a translator and editor and literary consultant, as well as Lesley's goddaughter and literary executor. So not only are you a woman of many parts, but it's fantastic to have this direct link to Lesley, as Georgia's going to tell you. It's really a marvellous book. I'm sure some of you have already read it, but it just captures Lesley's spirit and fills in the gaps. So it's wonderfully sensitively done, and I can't think of a better guide to a woman who is just an amazing woman. But before we go, I'm just going to give you a tiny introduction. I'm going to read you what Philip Mansell wrote in Figaro when she died. With the death of Lesley Blanch, aged 103, England and France have lost one of their last links connecting them to White Russian Paris, Free French London, and many other lost worlds. Her friends would leave her Ottoman eyrie in Menton invigorated and inspired. The subjects of her conversation were well beyond the conventional boundaries of time, space, nationality, and fashion. I often went to see her, attracted by her warm personality and colourful, cosmopolitan past. With a unique turn of phrase, she would talk equally passionately about film stars, racism, Arab culture, or the Mitford sisters. Well, I think that sets the scene brilliantly. And above all, how many writers do we know who choose a book title that enters the language as a phrase, the wilder shores of whatever it is? So there are many reasons to be celebrating Lesley, which Georgia's going to fill us in on. But just to be reassuring for the audience, actually, I always like to tell you what we're going to do, so there are no surprises. I'm going to ask Georgia a few questions. She's going to answer them brilliantly, of course, but she'll also include a couple of readings. Then we'll try and have a sort of more general discussion because, well, as you've probably gathered, I'm Anne Sebba, and I've written a book about women in Paris. Lesley was in Paris at one point. Many of the women I've written about are wild spirits, bohemians, trailblazers. So we're going to try and have some overlap, and then it's open to you. So I hope you'll have lots of questions. So that's the format. Please keep it lively and listen up, as it were. And Lesley, to start with, a very general question, but can you paint us a picture of Lesley? Both the Lesley you knew and the Lesley who is in this book. Where do you start?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming on this rather sleety night. But how great way to spend. Lesley, yes. Well, privately, she was very warm and funny and always amazingly dressed, even when she was in her nightie. Even her nighties were rather lovely. And she smelt of jasmine, and her house was like something out of 1001 Nights, and she was an amazing storyteller. She was also terribly funny, in that slightly Mitfordy way. But she did have another side, the public side. She could also be, actually it was quite formidable if, say, a member of the press came to interview her. There was this rather terrifyingly, rather cold. Yes, she became rather cold and very formidable, and it was quite scary, actually.
Was that because there were things she didn't want to say?
She was just, I think, because she had an extraordinary, but she had many lives. There was an element of scandal here and there. She reinvented herself, and I think it was just a defence. It was just like this, her first career in the theatre, and a huge love for this man, only ever known as a traveller, who turned out to be Theodore Komisarjevsky, who was Diaghilev's, he was the Diaghilev of the theatre world, then later Romain Gary, but that must have been rather publicly, just upsetting, humiliating. The first one went off with Penny Ashcroft, and the second with Jean Seberg.
Well,
so that's a public thing.
Stop for a minute. There's too much information there, because I think that The Traveller is so much part of what everyone knows.
Exactly.
And this extraordinary love affair with a man she doesn't want to identify, but you do identify.
Yeah.
And he obviously shaped the rest of her life. Who was he, and why was he so important? Because I think it's a wonderful story.
Well, he was a friend of the family's, basically. So imagine Chiswick, very lovely Chiswick, but rather cosy and outside London, and nothing much happens. And this character appears and puts on Chekhov at Barnes Theatre, and obviously an extraordinary storyteller and just extraordinarily seductive individual. John Gielgud, who was one of his students, said he had this extraordinary mesmeric quality. So he arrives and amazing stories and gifts and Fabergé eggs, and he was, of course, had fled the Russian Revolution. So it's a lot of glamour and drama, which I can imagine was must have been rather.
And he seduced her.
So eventually, eventually, not immediately, eventually. Which I guess, yes, it's not. Yeah, he took her to Paris. But the thing is that the huge, he took her to Paris on a train. He took her to Paris.
It didn't take
away
long
from the
to
parents.
Paris.
Away from parents. Yeah. No, but of course the mystery. I mean, I'm sorry in a way to destroy the mystery actually, because it is the way she writes about it is so beautiful. The whole point is the love, what he left with her, the love of culture, the way he opened doors onto many countries and cultures. I mean, because she was both very glamorous and romantic, but she was also extremely erudite, very scholarly, so they all knew she knew her stuff. And that it was to destroy that illusion of magic, because she was a fantasy. She created extraordinary stories, although she was a historian, the way she wrote about it, it was like the 1001 Nights. So
it was
anyway.
From him that she derived this love of Russia.
Yes, I think that he instilled absolutely a love of Russia, and also perhaps the travel, the train has a lot to answer for, isn't it? But yes, so and it sort of began. But I think she also was always longing to get away. She was on her bicycle, bicycling up. She had a very adventurous spirit. Was always very open and curious, and I think she wanted.
And do you think that came from meeting him, or
no, I think that was in her temperament, probably anyway.
And the sort of genteel poverty of her parents that she needed to escape from.
Yes, well, the mother's money ran out, basically. The father was a sort of vague antique dealer, not very...
It's very sort of Nesbitish, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
That, he means well, but he can't actually put his talent to bringing in any money.
No.
You look as if you're about to read us something. So
no, and I was just... Yes, because also there's a love of animals. Of course, there's always animals playing a huge role. I think one wonders how much they all really, between the parents, she describes him the father disappearing behind clouds of cigar smoke, Ladakh tobacco, rather, sorry, not cigar, Ladakh tobacco. So how much the mother, probably, her mother Martha, longed to get away. So that also instilled, and she was also a huge supporter of the suffragettes. So, but I was going to read, Lesley is the early part, because I started helping her on her memoirs, sort of by mistake, because I was staying with her, and she was supposed to deliver an introduction, was late, and was in a panic, so I helped type it up on a laptop, and we started, that's how it began. So the first part of the memoirs, she was about 100 when she was writing it. And then, because she died, and before the book was finished, we put together all that she'd written from pieces for Vogue, and what she wrote about her husband. But her earliest memories, I love this because it shows she was back to the little girl on the bicycle longing to get away, full of energy and escape, fantasy and desire to escape. Earliest memories, a few bright-coloured fragments like a shattered porcelain bowl that will not piece together. I'm angry, banging my head on the floor again and again in suicidal fury because I can't get my own way. About what, I have no idea, but I can still recall the hot vibrations of pain and rage. I was a violent child. Now something shining and golden comes into view. It is beautiful and I want it, but it is out of reach, and I begin to yell. I'm lifted up close to the object of my desire, and I still cannot get at it. This object was in fact a 16th century Flemish offertory plate, part of my father's collection of rare objects, Chinese porcelain, a Seljuk prayer rug, and all else, so that looking back, it seems that my lifelong craving to acquire heterogeneous objects of all ages, lands, and kinds was manifested early.
So tell us the nuts and bolts of what you've done. How much of her memoirs had Lesley actually written?
Well, she'd written snippets. So, for example, in the book, there's a whole section about Leo Lerman, Marlene Dietrich, New York. That's how we began. We wrote fragments as she remembered. She
would hand it to you bit by bit.
So she would, yes. So for example, and some of it's journalism, and there are pieces and then there are stray pieces of journalism, which some of it's actually undated. Anyway, the Lodestar longing about travelling, junking she wrote, New York, Leo Lerman, Carson McCullers and others, Los Angeles, Marlene Dietrich. So she started doing snippets like that, and then we began talking. Then she began writing properly, and what I would do is I'd go and see her every 3-4 months, and then I'd type it up, because of course she wrote longhand, very beautiful, and she would tape everything together. It was all Scotch taped together, and it was a sort of very homemade way of doing cut and paste, which you do with Microsoft Word now. So, and actually the archives, because all her papers were at Oxford, New College, and also at Yale. And New College had a lot of the manuscripts. They were complaining about all the Scotch tape, saying, "Oh, it's terrible! All this Scotch tape, it's all going to deteriorate." So I would then type it up, and then we'd do more Scotch taping.
And was she easy to work with, or did she say to you, "Oh no, you've got it wrong," or "That's not how I want it"?
Well, to begin with, she was quite prickly, because she was very, as I said, she was a warm, wonderful friend, and most people knew her. But even then, she was quite defensive about certain areas of her life, which I guess perhaps is understandable. She'd had such an extraordinary life and had led at least 9 lives, really. So she didn't, in anything that was perhaps a bit uncomfortable. She didn't always, but as I said, she began to open up. So it's the last time I saw her, she began to open up, and we were just coming to that, the theatre, her first work in the theatre and as a designer after leaving the Slade.
So why do you think she hadn't actually written this autobiography herself? I mean, do you think she really wanted to do it? Oh,
she really wanted to do it. I think there was a combination of procrastination, domestic irritations, not having anyone actually to type it up. I was very boringly practical, I'm sorry. But I think that because her house, it was a wonderful little pink villa up a hill behind the station of Garavant, shrouded in jungly leaves, and it was extraordinary when you went there. But there was a couple living down below, there were neighbours coming in and out, there was all kinds of uproar always, and interruptions and visits, and people wanted to interview her, and also then she was quite elderly. Yes. So, and then she would have it was extra. I've never known anyone have pneumonia so much and go in and out of hospital. She must have had pneumonia about 6 or 7 times. Most people would finish them off. And she was unbelievably tough, actually.
You say tough,
resilient. Or
I realise one of the paragraphs that I marked very early on, my glasses, and I wondered how relevant this was. You've written, like all good storytellers, Lesley mined that rich seam between imagination and reality. She plundered her life and her passions and turned tragedy into beauty, and believed that learning how to deal with pain is the most important thing in life. That's a very powerful paragraph. Tell us about the pain. I mean, her life wasn't easy at any point. So were there things she wouldn't talk about that were so painful? Or what was the pain that she had managed to deal with?
I think a lot of it was to do with her love life, I guess, and also disappointments, to do with work, to do with money. I mean, I know that, as I said, the first career was after leaving the Slade, where she was a contemporary with Oliver Messel, and then she worked in the theatre, not only actually with Komisarjevsky, because her portfolio appeared in 2014, which helped a lot. Suddenly all these designs for the productions, Komisarjevsky's productions at Stratford, and also for Marie Rambert, so she had a huge career, and also de Basille's Ballet Russe. Then that ended, she went to Vogue, and had an amazing, actually I think during the war, she had rather an amazing time, because there she was the feature editor of Vogue, working with Lee Miller and Cecil Beaton and everyone, and then she reinvented herself again when she met Romain, and they get married and leave England and go off on this extraordinary life to the Balkans and Mexico and America and everywhere, life en poste, and write. But I think that the tragedy and the pain a lot was heartache. It was, particularly the very extraordinary one, an amazing Russian dramatist, and the other an extraordinary Russian novelist who is in France. He's a complete household name now, but obviously extremely difficult individuals. Not easy if you think of a private life.
Yeah.
I mean, not, and then in between, of course. And she wasn't always so. She certainly could be. Yeah, she was tricky. We had occasions to.
But multi-talented. So she could have been an artist or a set designer, and she wrote novels and.
Well, no, it was largely she wrote one novel. So I brought these. I thought were quite funny because this is typical of the mischief and the wit and the naughtiness. This is, Lady L, and that's her cover design, the Michael Joseph edition. That is Romain's send-up of Lesley, basically. And it was made into an extremely bad film. I mean, wonderfully, I don't mean to sound, it is fabulous kitsch of the period with Peter Ustinov and Sophie Loren. And it's a grand lady of the realm who actually was originally a cool girl who is in love with an anarchist, and how she puts that all behind her, marriages and orgy. And then, of course, and then actually the dead lovers in a trunk. Anyway, there's a whole... but it's a complete send-up of the high society, women, essentially because she got out of the suburbs and made good and became very much a grande dame, and extraordinary, knew everybody, and she always said... This is a novel that she wrote about a man who, it's in the Indian Mutiny, seduces a whole load of women and ends up he's got a harem. He's keeping them all safe on an island in the middle of a lake to avoid the mutiny. And that's her send-up, obviously, of her womanizing husband.
But, serious historian.
Yes.
And yet self-taught almost. I know she went to St. Paul's, but that was school. It's not university. Where did she learn? I mean,
voracious reader. Her library was extraordinary. There was
so she worked at it.
Oh yeah, she was a huge reader, and in her letters she writes. There she is in some library researching. Oh no, she really was a huge reader and researcher, and really did it properly. And yeah, I think at home they were very cultivated, and then Komisarjevsky, of course, and then later other friends, and people then you read. I mean, I suppose you had less. You didn't have books were the thing. I mean, because she was there also at the onset. After leaving Vogue in '44, she wrote for a year for a magazine called The Leader, which was the sister publication to Picture Post, and she was a film critic for them, writing profiles of Vivian Leigh and Peter Ustinov and a friend and all of that. So
of inventing herself with new careers that is so extraordinary. It's just having the faith in yourself and then being able to carry it off. I want to ask you about her beauty, because she was very beautiful. I mean, she was stunningly attractive and must have known it. I wonder to what extent her beauty was an impediment. But I want to talk about her beauty in the way that it attracted men and what that did to her life. I mean, we know that she married this man in Richmond for his house, and that didn't last very long.
She was very honest. They were completely on their uppers. They had no money at all. The father, I think he died in 1933, and the mother had to take in lodgers eventually. So yes, it was that again. That actually comes out slightly in Parisiennes. Those days, you know, a woman, you couldn't get the job. You didn't have the welfare state. You had no support at all. And don't forget, the 20s was a very tough. You had the Depression. There was a lot of economic problems. So sometimes you're stuck. You know, you marry a man for his house. Okay, I mean, it's not. But I think people still do that now. Really, they might dress it up. Actually, I'd be rather delighted if somebody bought me a house. Actually,
Jane Austen-ish thing.
Rather good.
But well, then the love affair with Romain Gary was the real love of her life. Is that?
I think both Russians in their different ways. I guess. No, she really did love him. But it's interesting because there was quite an interesting. They obviously got on terribly well. It was an intellectual affinity, and he also loved her knowledge of Russian culture. Because of course she'd met all these characters when she was young. The famous seduction in Paris. So she and then with Komisarjevsky on the tableau, but she'd also gone to see a Diaghilev rehearsal. She'd watched in the wings. She'd met Mozrukin, who Gary used to claim was his father. So that must have been amazingly attractive to him, that she really was steeped in Russian history and culture. And when she travelled around Russia in the 30s, she was interested in Gogol and the writer. She was never particularly interested in the politics. It was the culture. And when she wrote all her great book, The Sabres of Paradise, which is an extraordinary book about the fight against imperialist Russia.
How did that arise? What was the starting point for that book?
Just
being inspired by...
Might actually have probably had something to do. Her mother might have talked about it. The mother also had quite an extraordinary range of... She read... I know her mother also talked about Pierre Loti. So it might have been the mother.
But Romain Gary gave her his work to look at and read, expecting a critique, or
I think so. Yeah, because she was a good critic.
He looked to her for stimulation and
yes, I think they looked to each other. Yes, and she didn't altogether go for all of his writing, but she could tell he was very special and gifted, and would go because he was very ambitious and to be a great novelist, and he was. I mean, he is an extraordinary novelist. Anyway. But he gave her the freedom to travel, because again, those days, to travel, after the war, the borders, you couldn't travel, the borders were closed, I mean, forget it. So he was a diplomat, so great, because he was actually the Consul de France, and by the time he got to LA, very much
Bulgaria.
So they went to Bulgaria, so, he left her free to roam where she liked. So that was important then for women. Because again, that touches a parallel with the Parisiennes. Women then were really supposed to be at home, and it was less usual, perhaps. I'm not saying women, of course, had careers, but it was less usual, less easy. So the fact that she could travel and go to the Sahara and do all her research for women in the world, The Shores of Love, that was.
So the job at Vogue as features writer, was that really her first real job? I mean, that brought her income and some security.
Yes, I guess so. Yeah.
And that's where she got to know Lee Miller. Did they actually work together?
Yes, some of these. She wrote in the war. She wrote there were various features written to raise the morale of women during the war. So she wrote about the wrens, the seaworthy and semi-seagoing. Nightlife Now, the women's services, that's June 1943, the photos were done by Lee Miller. So yes, they collaborated. Absolutely.
Because, my point of view is that for women, war is fulfillment, almost always, in terms of the men being away fighting, gives the women an opportunity to have a job, and often it's romance as well. And, war... As an aphrodisiac, war does all sorts of terrible things, but this is one of the byproducts, and certainly women like Lee Miller and Lesley, to an extent. I don't know enough about Leslie's War. I mean, what else was she doing? That was...
Well, those days also, the general thing, the woman had to get married. And then if it worked or not, Lesley said she'd been married 3 times. So we definitely know of 2 marriages. The third one, we're not so sure. Anyway, did she marry Komisarjevsky or not? We don't think so. But between, of course, there were affairs. Between there were affairs, and what I would have asked her,
yes,
very frustrating. Anyway, but
and she
between there were affairs. She might not have. She might have had that snapped shut look that she got. It was a sort of like the clam shuts. Like, oh, I've gone too far. Yes,
interesting.
But she's the war. She, of course, because being a bit of an adrenaline, she loved adventure. After all her travels, she was travelling in the 60s in Siberia and out of Mongolia and everything. She loved risks and danger, really. So, which I think perhaps most travellers, the real big travellers, you need an edge.
Yes, I love the phrase that she liked to travel heavy.
Yeah.
I'm going to acquire that one because I too like to travel heavy. But
they all had affairs. I think she did say, it was a free-for-all with a twinkle. She was particularly keen on Polish men, which, good Lord, after all, Romain was Russian-Polish. Yes. He was born in Lithuania, I think Vilnius, was it? Anyway.
Yes.
So...
little bit about being so beautiful, because it does fascinate me whether that means she's not taken entirely seriously as an intellect, but also fashion is the same thing. I mean, I'm not remotely suggesting that she needed designer labels or to have the latest clothes, but she cared about what she looked like, and often for women that's considered something negative, but she managed to pull it off, I think, because she had her own type of fashion. But it's obviously something I've been thinking a lot about with Parisian women, because they too used fashion as a tool of resistance. But how would you describe her fashion? Was it important to her how she looked? She was trying to pin you down on this.
A great seductrice. She was very seductive. She always smelled of jasmine. I mean, she was very soft skin, smelled delicious, always beautifully dressed. But she was very beautiful, but she was not tall, and she did get a little bit plump in a lovely rondouillette sort of way. So she had clothes made up for her, and she would buy lovely, lovely, lovely clothes wherever she travelled, and some of them have ended up at the V&A. So she created her own style, and that was unusual. There's a very lovely drawing of her by Louise de Villemorin from the late 40s, and she's in the big baggy red satiny kind of pants that she got in the Balkans, and a tight belt, and it's fantastically stylish. It's that sort of chic that later Yves Saint Laurent and everyone made, very chic, with all their 60s collections of Russian and Middle Eastern look. She was doing that years before. She just had this, and then some people used to, in Hollywood, of course, in LA, that eccentric English woman, and even Haute-Brune, when because she and Romain had a little house in Haute-Brune, a little village between Monte Carlo. It's on a little hill overlooking the Mediterranean, in the Vieux Village. So it's one of those villages that goes up a hill, and there's a little old fortress in the middle. And they were the first foreigners there. They got a little house there in 1948, and it was a village of everyone had rabbits and grew lettuces. And then suddenly there are Romain and Lesley in these huge Balkan boots and hats. It's like, who are these people from ET's arrived? It was really everyone. It's extraordinary.
Did she play on her exoticism?
But they used to call her the old hippie, because she wore, already in the 60s, with her friend Frida Harris, another extraordinary woman who floated up and down the Ganges and designed Aleister Crowley's tarot toe deck, which is not bad. Oh yes, I love that. Aleister Crowley was a launcher. Good Lord, imagine that. Anyway, yes, so they used to call her the old hippie.
She played up on all of this. She knew that.
She was a dramatist.
Yes.
Oh, she was fantastic.
Yes.
I loved watching when she put on a show, when she went into diva mode. It was absolutely superb. I wish I'd filmed it. She was amazing. Because if you think about it, her early career actually was in drama. And so then she figured out, even in her writing, when you read her, in Sabres actually, there were wonderful descriptions of harem life in the Sabres of Paradise. Now, she claimed that she had been in a harem herself with Sheikh Zayed in the 70s, possibly. There are photos of them together, so maybe she did spend time in his harem, I don't know. I mean, with Lesley, there was an element also, all of it was true, but she was such a storyteller. You then do wonder where the spin comes in, because she and Romain also was extraordinary with image and spin and storytelling. I think they really understood about spin and storytelling
themselves.
Long before it became people hire spin doctors now. They weren't doing that, so they knew certainly how to play, certain. Yes.
Well, she is in a way an honorary Parisienne, not because she lived there, although she did live there for a while, but just because she knew how to create a style and to live with that style and feel comfortable with it. But she also, as you say, had this erudition, so attractive at many, many levels. The other thing, of course, we haven't talked about is food, her love of food. Now, I think that's something deeply sensual in enjoying these pleasures. So where did that come from? How did she...
Yes, it was again a very interesting mixture, because I would take her steak and kidney pies and sausages and sew it in my suitcase. I think now I probably wouldn't be able to. But then she would produce all kinds of Russian dishes and, I don't know, extraordinary kidneys in something, and Middle Eastern. There's an amazing Russian dish with kidneys. Actually, I wish I knew what it was. No, I don't know what it was. Anyway, and Middle Eastern, all kinds of Middle Eastern dishes. So it was a very extraordinary mixture of food when one went to see her.
Food and smells
and
clothes and
oh yes, and talk. Mischief.
Would you say she was courageous? And if so, how would you specify her type of courage? I think it's probably because of the difficulties and losing houses, losing possessions during the war, the house that was bombed, and love. I mean, if you fall passionately in love, you fall hard when it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
But what do you think?
Well, she bounced back. It was extraordinary. And I mean, actually, the fire in 1994, she was in her 80s. So imagine your house burns down. And she's like, okay, we'll rebuild it. I mean, some people would think that's it. I'm moving into a flat, in Monte Carlo looking at the sea. None of it. She had it rebuilt. And a lot of her things were actually rescued. And an extraordinary amount of papers and books considering what happened. But there are photos, and I don't know, that I thought in itself, she was very courageous about all kinds of things.
We called this, or you've called it, a bohemian life. And I know you and I have had discussions as to what constitutes a bohemian. How do you define it? It's obviously something to do with not wanting roots in boring Chiswick. I mean, that's far too suburban and unexciting. But it means something more. What do you think it means?
Well, first of all, I want to say bohemian. I know it's pretty hackneyed now. Everyone, bohemian. But then I think it's really an attitude. It's a state of mind. It's because then perhaps society expectations. It was much more rigid, I guess. So to actually get out from under and do your own thing, and to actually dare to stand up, because also she did have to deal with, there was a lot of misogyny, there was a lot of resistance. So and I think that, and also quite often court cases and plagiarism and people, all kinds of. So she stood up for herself and critics, and the bohemian thing. Well, no, the bohemian thing was just very non-judgmental. You could talk to her, I mean, it was extraordinary, about affairs of the heart, about life, about human nature, about problems, and she would not sit. She wouldn't sit in judgment. She'd have an interesting, she'd listen. She was a very good listener. She was a very good listener. So she would listen, and she was very open-minded and tolerant. And of course, she was very open to new ideas and to different cultures, and amazingly so. There was not a wall in sight. Forget it, certainly, no walls. And I mean, she was about 100 when I was there with a little laptop, and we were talking about the internet and websites and things, and showed her one of those dongle things that we managed to get online. And this was in about 2004, I suppose, 3 or 4. And she was fat. Oh, I want one of those, she said. Oh, she had this way of, oh. But there are friends of hers here, so it would be, I know they were Philip and it would be, I'm sure they will remember that, the way she answered the phone, and there's a certain darling self. She was very, she would take the mickey out of herself. Darling self. She had absolutely, she was amazing that way, the way she, forget doubt, and though I think she did have periods of, I'm sure behind the facade there were periods of despondency, and...
But it's, I think a bohemian spirit is being able to, or not being able to, but needing to embrace other cultures, and...
Well, you're free, and it's a free thinking thing, really. You're free...
And of course, at the period where she lived, I mean, the other subtitle, I think, for this talk is Trailblazing Women. Well, she did blaze a trail at a time when women weren't expected to earn their own living, and she wasn't educated to earn her living. Her parents must have brought her up to expect a husband to take care of her, and she bucked that trend. But I'm sure there must have been periods of doubt and difficulty as well, and overcoming the pain.
Because Romain Gary always used to complain, oh, you always write about women's things and women. He used to complain about always writing about women, which was actually wonderful, because the 4 women, of course, she's most known for, Eberhard and Digby, and the others in the original one, The Shores of Love. And the joke is she was the 5th one who got away.
Yes, well, of course, there's self-identity.
But they were all women somehow getting out from under, doing their thing. Or one, I mean, even the Burton ménage, she adores her explorer husband and pay, pack and follow and all of that. But actually reading that, I mean, there's a lot of personal, you sort of feel rather as though, are we reading about Romain and Lesley here? Having known, but I mean, that's just anyway.
No, well, I mean, these women, certainly Lesley is blazing a trail, and the women in Paris, who didn't even have the vote until 1946 and yet played this huge role during the war, were bucking a trend of what women of their generation were expected to do. Are you going to read something else?
Actually, I will.
Oh, and then you can ask me.
I was going to say, in your book, I love all the wonderful details, and one of them is in 1938 only women were allowed to go out to work without permission from husbands and fathers.
Well,
good Lord,
and
that's
there were a lot of
trailblazing. That's incredible.
A lot of unhappy, unfulfilled women. My heroine, Odette Fabius, was in 1939 seeing a psychiatrist because she was so unfulfilled. But
so I will read a couple of paragraphs about Soho after the Slade. After she left the Slade in 1924. My time at the Slade was in an intermediary period post Carrington and Spencer and before the impudent gaiety and colour brought by Rex Whistler or Oliver Messel some years hence. Each day, our classes over, we dispersed variously about the gloomy Bloomsbury streets. A clot of the more advanced students all rushed off to Charlotte Street, where Stulick's restaurant was the headquarters of a group centred around Augustus John, who was often there at that time, a rakish Bacchus with his harem of admirers pressed close, all attired in a uniform of loose, graceful garments, and noticeably unfettered, with hair tumbling and very free with their talk. There were goings-on, it was said with reverence. But I did not really fit in, so dawdled away towards Waterloo Station. For I was still kept on a string, and expected home by 7, which was ridiculous, but eloquent of my mother's views of the Bloomsbury into which she had pitched me. She wrote Spotlight, writing from the Vogue years, so I've chosen a section which is also relevant, links back to the Parisiennes, London during the war. Living the sheltered life. London, with red, white and blue circles under its eyes, carries on. Arguments on the for and against of taking cover continue. Each side glows with a happy conviction of right. One lot have been foolhardy, the others obedient. Or one lot have been brave, the others lazy, according to how you look at it. Vegetable window boxes thrive, parsley and herbs being less light obscuring than cabbages. Wedding cakes assume a surrealistic aspect, for since sugar rationing, their icing facades have been replaced by satin covers, elaborately trimmed with lace frills, hand-painted bouquets, scrolls of silk cord, and embroidered in suitable, felicitous phrases. What a chance for hard-hit milliners to launch forth into new extravaganzas. And then, apropos millinery, snoods have taken a turn for the military. Last year they adorned the back of every woman's head. This year the Home Guard cover their faces with them by way of camouflage and drape them across their tin hats, with leaves and twigs added to taste, as worn at the training school at Osterley Park. Brings in. Then, Romain describes, this is typical of Lesley's humour, this is her description of marriage day. She met Romain at a party, probably given by Germaine Canova, who was actually the French Lee Miller, who's rather forgotten, but an extraordinary woman. She, for the French,
but they met in London.
Yeah, they met in London. But at the Libération, and later she went and photographed all the camps when they were being, like Lee Miller did. So there are still in the Archives Nationales, there are all her photos and things. So they probably at one of her parties that they met. And here is Lesley's humour about their marriage, and also about actually Romain being Jewish. We got married on the 4th of April 1945. A few days before the wedding, I returned home rather depressed by a film on rebuilding London's ruins, which I was reviewing for the Ministry of Information to send to America. I found Romain looking particularly disturbed. "There is something I have to tell you," he said gloomily. I steeled myself for the worst. "I think you ought to know. I'm Jewish," he said. I don't remember my reply, as his announcement did not seem of much consequence to me at the time. In my family, I cannot recall ever hearing disparaging remarks, or indeed any remarks whatever, made regarding the Jewish race or religion. But Romain had spoken with a curious mixture of defiance and discomfort, while I was not yet aware of just how heavy a load a Jewish heritage could seem, how it could close round with stifling tentacles of emotion and even shame. I recall him sitting there in one of what I called his disaster poses, head in hands. "Well, I thought you ought to know," he repeated lamely. Suddenly he looked amused. "So you'll be my goy wife." And with that, the matter was closed. As our wedding day loomed closer, it seemed an unwelcome interruption to the agreeable free way we were living. Romain developed a streaming head cold and took to his bed, a psychosomatic manifestation of delaying tactics, no doubt. Carrying invalid delicacies up 2 flights of stairs was making me a little testy, but he showed no signs of recovery and continued to stream. "If I don't feel better on Tuesday, I shan't come to the ceremony," he announced thickly, to which I replied, "Oh, do try, darling. It won't be the same thing without you." I burst out laughing at my own quip, but the invalid was not amused. This was no laughing matter. When 2 days later we were married at the registry office, I thought it all rather an anticlimax. Smug and conventional, too, like the rings we exchanged. I suggested he should wear his in one ear, pirate fashion. It would have suited his exotic appearance, but I was ahead of my time. Men did not indulge in such fantasies then.
Yes, I've got an anecdote in my book about Romain Gary when he was presented to the Queen Mother, wasn't he? And who asked where he came from, and he just decided it was too complicated to go there. where he came from, so being Jewish wasn't of enormous significance to him. I wanted to ask you if you thought, I mean, I know you say she was a woman ahead of her time.
They were both huge Gaullists, so de Gaulle,
Yes.
kind of the great, he was the great hero, the great god.
Who had led.
So, so that I think, no, but she was very oddly, she was sort of her time, she also looked backwards, because after all she was a historian. So she was writing about women in the 19th century, or Imam Shamil in the Sabres. But then she was also very forward-looking, and it was, yes, in some ways she wasn't at all feminist, but on the other hand,
you shouldn't expect her
and
to
she was
be
quite submissive to her men as well, oddly.
Yes.
She was both very
handed to
out there,
them
but handed them terribly, so that very odd mix. But she certainly believed in equal pay. I think equal rights and equal pay, she was very keen on that women should, be given that. She was terribly keen on things to do with the workplace. But I agree, I think perhaps domestically and in the bedroom, I don't know, it was something else. So it was, again, it's interesting, but we are all, and that actually, again, with your book, it's not black and white, it's not, it's a sort of mixture of
transition
period, all kinds
anyways.
of, and people are a mixture, they might, anyway, so, yeah. It was,
should
anyway.
we?
No.
Yes, we should.
Questions.
Questions, please. I hope you've all got lots. Yes.
Can I just make an observation? When I was reading your excellent obituary of Claire Hollingworth today, I was contrasting Leslie's travel heavy always with something in Claire Hollingworth. She said, I always travel with the minimum amount of things.
Yeah.
One tiny case, a change of clothes, I think that was it, which amused me in this context.
Yes, I've been thinking of women who make their lives abroad and almost go native, and the similarities of just carving out that career for yourselves, which of course Claire Hollingworth certainly did.
Straightforward, exactly. So you don't take all the knickknacks with it. Therefore, your personality changes if you travel a lot. You're not the same person anymore if you stay at home all your life, or if you travel like these people do. That changes your personality and your outlook on life. No?
But she also, she had animist beliefs. She was very keen on things, and that things have an energy, and that rather, I think she probably got that from The Traveller, actually. But so she was very much, there was something about, even when she was in hospital, you'd go into her room and it was fabulous. There were drapes, and it was all it was divine. It was lovely. She decorated it. And I think there was something really about making it cosy and home. I don't know. Yes, and also the Edwardians. Anyway, I mean, they were actually. She didn't. They were. She was originally Edwardian. There was a lot of clutter. There was a lot of stuff. So now, of course, that is absolutely not. You get rid of the clutter. You declutter. But then that was not really. Anyway.
On the other hand, yes, okay, you, oh.
Yes.
I would just like to know who your parents were that you became the goddaughter as Lesley Blanch. How did you become the goddaughter?
Yes, no, my mother, Gail Elton Mayo, she met Lesley in 1951 in New York. Her first, because she married 3 times. She was a very lovely looking, very beautiful woman, artist, writer, worked with Magnum photographers, Cartier-Bresson and Kappa, and was a huge idealist. Her husband, Theodore von Schneer, was Polish-Russian and was a friend of Romain Gary's. So they had to, actually reading the Parisiennes, again, huge, the escape story getting out of occupied France. My mother was 17, had a baby while bombs were dropping in Bordeaux. They got into Free France, but that wasn't much better, and some black marketeer stinking of garlic tried to seduce her in a limousine. I mean, all kinds of things. Oh, I don't know, both of them, the lives they had. Anyway, but they managed to get out with a passeur into Spain, ship all the way up South American coast into New York, refugees. So then they were in New York for a bit. Mon pote Romain, anyway, so they were pote Romain, so that's how the English wives and Russian husbands. And Lesley and Romain were living in the Hungarian quarter. And she was busy researching, my mother was very funny about it, doing all the research for Wilder Shores of Love and Lyoté and the women, and also the military background and the colonial background. Romain would, because Romain was manic depressive, so that was so he would disappear. He was fine, and then he would disappear into the back room, completely depressed, wailing about his health and I need green beans. And I mean, apparently it was a very entertaining ménage, but they were also very, very funny. So my mother, that marriage didn't last either. Zephyr, great guy, but also a phenomenal womanizer, remarried, and then my mother remarried and came back to Europe and zigzagged back and forth. And my father was the third one, and he was French. So then my parents, they were living in Paris, and then this was after Lesley and Romain divorced. The divorce finally went through in 1963. They were frequently, Lesley and Nancy Mitford, and also Yusupov, and all these various characters used to come for dinner. And Lesley ended up being my godmother. So, and yes, she was, yes, if that helps.
I've got one more question. You were her goddaughter. To what extent do you think she saw you as the daughter she never had? I mean, was she in any way maternal towards you, at any rate?
She was the wonderful, actually like a godmother figure to a lot of the children of her friends. She was very good with younger people. But I think, no, she lost it. That's in the book. She had a child had to be given away and adopted. And I think she had the most terrible time having that child. And also she did, I think that's perhaps partly why she never had a child with Romain Gary, because of having backstreet abortions, which you touch on in your book.
Yes.
You know, I think that some women were, anyway, it just didn't, and also she was by the time, but she could have probably had a child with him. Anyway.
Did she ever talk about the child she'd given away?
And I don't think she would, darling self, I don't think darling self didn't really particularly know. She wasn't particularly maternal, no. They were all, no, what I think it would have been if you had a child, the child was sort of bumbled along with the suitcases. You know, it would not have been in a suitcase, but it might have been rather like a suitcase. No, I'm saying that in just a very practical way. It's just, you know, the way children now, they were very busy and driven to do, you know, that anyway. I don't know what happened. She was given away. It was pre-adoption laws. It was in the 20s. It was in 1919. I mean, she was incredibly young. So the daughter, I think it was pre the Adoption Act of 1923 or something. Well, she's probably dead, actually. Probably dead. Who knows? Maybe. I don't know. It's mysterious. Well, yes, she was a great friend of Nancy Mitford's. And yes, they were great friends and corresponded, also living in Paris. And yes, that was her particular friend. And all the letters, the Mitford's letters to Nancy, the letters are all with Yale now. So it's all part of that archive. So,
and also in Paris, she was friends, which I find amazing, with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, whom she rather liked.
No, I mean, she had a very mondain street. Yes. She rather liked hobnobbing. I mean, she had an extraordinary range of friends. That it was quite extraordinary. But she rather enjoyed it, all that.
A rich variety of life.
And Violet Trefusis, of course.
Yeah, that's understandable.
You know, there was, yes.
And what would she like to be remembered for? If there was one thing that you could pick, would it be the wilder shores of love, or?
It would be the Sabres of Paradise, I think.
Okay.
And it would be that thing. She was obsessed with bridging East and West, understanding. She was keen on. Yes, sure.
If it was the Sabres of Paradise.
I think Sabres of Paradise was the great book that she really loved.
And I think that's a good definition of what it is to be a bohemian, someone who is able to embrace other cultures and, as you say, bridge East and West. It's an okay thing to be remembered for. So well done for this. Are there any other questions? We really don't have to finish if there are, and I think there are drinks anyway, but is there a hand? No?
Yeah, I'd like explain this idea of travelling heavy. I might have missed something you said. I mean, is that a euphemism?
The opposite of travelling light.
Lots of bags and stuff and paraphernalia. She loved. Yeah, she knows.
Kitchen sink.
And she left a trail of scarves and stuff behind her. Yeah, she left. She'd lose. Oh I mean, it was quite something. She'd lose
She had
things.
lots of
And,
assistants and lots of
no, or some person would be roped in. Or something. No, Sue Train, my former, that's why I've actually got here, this is linking with Les Parisiennes. Sue Train, the literary executor, she was the Paris bureau chief, Condé Nast, described going on a shoot in the 60s to the Middle East with, Lesley was commissioned a lot by Diana Vreeland to write for VOGUE in the 60s, and they would take the models, just pose in the ruins of Palmyra and stuff. But how Lesley left trails of scarves and hats and things everywhere, and everyone was rushing around picking them up after her. She had that she was grande dame diva. She had that quite imperious. She would expect. She had that side to her, certainly. Yes, the Théâtre de la Mode, anyway, that relates to something that happened.
I just made notes of such extraordinary things, really, where she talked about her life with Romain. And, for example, were we jealous of each other's work? Of course not. Nevertheless, I think all men hold some profound atavistic view of their wives as adjuncts to themselves, dare I say, accessories. A wife's sole interest should be himself. And then she talks about how they were very great friends. He used to say, she's talking of her life with Romain Gary, Lesley doesn't mind my infidelities. She's very 18th century. Really an extraordinary life, and thank you for putting it all together and making it just so readable in such a sensitive way.
We wanted more about the Parisiennes. I've been trying to link back. I've been trying to link back.
You know, we're here to... A book that tries to look at the myriad responses of women to the occupation of their country by the Nazi army. And I felt that insofar as anyone had looked at the women's response at all, because Paris became a feminized city, 2 million men were taken as prisoners of war, other men came, young men of fighting age came to London to join de Gaulle. So Paris, almost uniquely, was a city of women other than old men and children. And it was the women who on a daily basis had to decide how to respond to the German occupiers, whether they'd get up and leave a restaurant if Germans came in, which could be a risk of being picked up and arrested if they did that. Or should they be charming? Should they take charming a stage further and indulge in sexual collaboration? Many of them found the Germans very charming. There were genuinely romantic views, but by and large I felt that the women who resisted, often in small ways, by hiding, evading airmen, by helping resistors go from one safe house to another, by pushing political tracts underneath the door. All these were considered by de Gaulle minor acts, and they weren't recognized after the war because they hadn't carried weapons, so they weren't theoretically combatants, so they weren't awarded medals. And I felt that the sum total of these acts actually deserved recognition. Not all women were brave and courageous, not all of them actively fought, but many more of them were than I think has been recognised historically. So I tried to show that women aren't all good, they aren't all bad, there's this diverse range, and when you bring it all together, it creates some sort of patchwork that for some reason doesn't seem to have been looked at before, but Paris gives us this opportunity to look at how women responded to the enemy.
I mean, it's a wonderful book, you will buy it. But it does put the whole question of choice. That's the thing, the choice. Yes. Making choices, morality and motivation is not black and white. And the whole moral ambiguity, like a kaleidoscope. And that really comes out how, and the way, for example, a brothel near the Gare Saint-Lazare, was it? On one hand, they're welcoming the Nazis, but on the other hand, they're also quietly en douce in the back room. You've got fallen British airmen being rescued and helped to get to free France. So there's a lot of that double game going on. I mean, I know even my own mother, who was 17 in the war, one night when they were trying to get to free France with a Russian husband and a little baby who'd been born, they were all bombed, and the Nazis kept on pointing at them, saying, "Ooh, Aryans." And so, in fact, they stayed in a little hotel bang opposite the Gestapo headquarters, thinking we won't be looked for there. Well, that, you know, and that's the kind of thing.
No, I think
that comes
prostitutes really are the one group of women
and brothels
whose
were very
stories
interesting because they really did a lot for the resistance, which I think. And I will just add this one comment. I love this. A Nazi prosecutor remarked to one of a group of female resistants being deported to Germany, "Madame, if the French army had been composed of women and not men, we Germans would never have gotten to Paris." That, for me, I thought that's it in a nutshell. Brilliant.
And she is an extraordinary story, Agnès Humbert, who wrote a diary. And after the war, she believed that her own son had collaborated because he'd been in the Navy and he'd had to work with the Germans, and she refused to speak to her own son. I mean, it is almost impossible to get yourself into the mind frame of what I would have done, because there are so many variables.
It is true. The couture is interesting. Of course, Chanel. I mean, of course, Paris and fashion, of course. You know, Chanel. You know, and her lover, and you know, some houses opened and shut, and you know, Nazis. What is it? The price of bags shot up.
Well, Chanel moved into the Ritz with her younger German lover and had a very comfortable war. He brought her lots of black market goodies.
Yeah.
And de Gaulle told all the women in 1946 to go back to their homes and to give the jobs up for the men. So it was an extraordinary decade, and I felt that it chimed with Lesley's life and was just the other side of the coin almost. So I'm sorry I haven't talked more about it, but I didn't think that was my role tonight. But you can always read the book.
But so thank you, everybody, for being here.